webinar. Thank you all for being here and taking the time. My name is Janae Bonsu. I am with BYP 100, stands for Black Youth Project 100, based in Chicago. And the purpose of this webinar is to launch the Freedom to Thrive, Reimagining Safety and Security in Our Communities report that was authored by the Center for Popular Democracy, Law for Black Lives, and BYP 100 in collaboration with over a dozen community-based organizations, some of which are joining us on this webinar today as panelists. And this report is super important because it really advances what folks are calling an Invest, Divest framework, which really seeks to shift power and resources away from oppressive punishment systems like police and prisons toward community priorities that actually make us safer. So just to give a rundown of our time together, we will hear from Marbre Sally-Butts from Law for Black Lives, who's gonna give us a grounding in the Invest Divest frame, give us some data on what actually makes us safe, and just really summarize the report for us. And then I'm gonna kick it to Kate Hamaji and Tracy Corder from Center for Popular Democracy. So gonna really break it down in plain language how the budgets of the 12 cities that we profiled were analyzed, and also give some key findings from the report from the different cities that we talked to. And then Rosanna Mercedes from the Participatory Budgeting Project, as well as BYP 100, will talk about participatory budgeting as a model for community governance in a way that Invest, Divest campaigns can really model what this looks like, what community control over money looks like, right? And then we're gonna get into a really dope panel that I'm gonna introduce more when we get there. But we have folks from Atlanta, Orlando, New York City, and Oakland represented tonight that's gonna really talk about the local work organizations that are throwing down on the ground on Invest, Divest campaigns. So we've got a lot going on tonight, a lot of great things. I'm looking forward to learning more about these campaigns. So just to flag, if folks are on the computer, you can type in questions in a chat box. We'll be taking questions throughout. So if we are good and stay on time, we'll have some time at the end to pose some of those questions to our panelists, and then we'll close. So without further ado, I want to pass it on to Marbre to kick us off.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Janae, as always, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. So I'm going to really briefly just break down what's in the report and then talk a little bit about the Invest Divest frame and then pass it on. So next slide. The report is actually a culmination of over 6 months of work, and it examines the racial disparities, policing landscapes, and budgets in 12 jurisdictions. So that includes Atlanta, Georgia, Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, Houston, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, New York City, Orlando, Oakland, and then St. Louis County and Contra Costa County in California. And the idea of the report was really to look at how much money these counties are using on or spending on policing versus on supportive services like education, healthcare, and other things that actually make us safer. The report is based on interviews with over 24 organizations across the country who really took the time and were generous enough to kind of speak to us about what the priorities of their community organizations and their members were, and what their members thought actually would be good investments for the city. A lot of those organizations, some of them are on the phone tonight, have been engaged in this fight around trying to really reorientate budgets and to center the reality that investments in policing and incarceration and cages and surveillance are actually ethical choices about who it is that we want to invest in. And so a lot of the dope-ass work is featured throughout the report, and some of the campaigns are also elevated. It also includes a Budget 101 section that familiarizes readers with exactly how the budget process works, and just a quick preview, we'll be releasing a toolkit that actually breaks that down even further with some dope graphics by the end of the week that will send out to everyone who's on the webinar. And then lastly, it ends with a section that discusses participatory budgeting. And the idea of that is that although it's really important to influence and change what's in our budgets, that ultimately we want to actually be community controlled and governing our own budgets. And so not just what's in them, but also how they're made. So it's a comprehensive report that we hope you would check out. Next slide. So the report comes out of actually the kind of, and is inspired by folks across the country, many of whom we interviewed and on the phone, and folks who we didn't get a chance to interview, who have been doing invest, divest work for literally decades. And so this includes kind of books, not balls, safety on policing. It goes by a lot of names, but the premise, as Janae said, really is that the choice to spend billions and trillions of dollars over the last few decades on cages and cops and surveillance, as opposed to spending that money on people and their health and their education and employment, is an ethical choice. And then if we want to actually thrive and want our communities to thrive, we have to divest from these harmful systems and invest in systems that make us stronger and safer. And so this is actually also based on a few facts. Number one is the reality that the US has drastically increased the amount of money it spends on policing, on incarceration, and on surveillance. So, for instance, on average, the US spends $100 billion on police every year. Much of that money comes from local city governments and all pockets, really, taxpayer pockets. And there's about $80 billion spent at the national level on incarceration and cages. And this is really a result of, since the 80s and 90s, there was a bipartisan effort that really resulted in the passage of thousands of laws that made behavior that wasn't criminal in 1985 criminal in 1986. And that's everything from sound ordinances to folks wearing saggy pants. And it really was an attack on Black and Brown communities. And so what we also know is that Black and Brown communities are targeted and persecuted around mass incarceration and policing. And so there's a disproportionate impact on our communities when it comes to the enforcement of these new laws and the hiring of armies of new police to enforce them. What we also know is that over the last 30 years, there has been a drastic cut in infrastructure, health services, support for housing and subsidies, food programs, and mental health support. So at the same time that we see this exponential rise in investments in cages and police, we see this sharp decline in investments in infrastructure in our communities, really. And what we also know is that because of redlining and systemic racism, that these divestments and these cuts and this choice to divest from our health, from our schools, from our roads, from our homes, also most impacted our communities, Black and Brown communities. And so, for instance, in Los Angeles in 2010, there was a $640 million deficit for the LA County school system. And that same year, they spent over $1 billion to cage people in LA County jail. And so we see the same neighborhoods that are being denied an education are also being locked up. And that's how the U.S. is spending its money. And so, as a result, one of the major investments that cities and states make in Black and Brown communities is actually in the form of military-grade equipment, weapons, police, and cages, and not education. Next slide. And this is especially, I think, horrific and stark, because what we actually know from data is that police and cages don't make us safer. That what actually makes us safer is increased education. We see that a 10% increase in graduation rates reduces crime by 12% over 10 years. We know that lower unemployment rates and increased real wages make us safer. We know that job programs make us safer. And there's data behind all of that. And yet, despite that, cities and states across the country continue to pour money into things that target Black and Brown communities, target our people, and cage our people, and refuse to actually invest in the things that make us stronger and safer and allow us to thrive. And so that is kind of the foundation of the report. And I think the other real premise of the report is that budgets are actually value documents. And so this choice by the cities and the states across the United States to not invest in our health or our thriving, but instead to invest in our caging and our harassment and our policing and surveillance is actually a value choice. It's a devaluing of our communities and our lives. And so that's kind of the premise of the report. I'm going to pass it on to Kate around the methodology of the report.
Hey, everyone. So just a couple words about how we analyze the budgets in this report. So the Freedom to Thrive report looks at spending on police and incarceration and, as Marbury explained, compares it to what cities and counties are spending on true safety investments. So specifically youth development, job training and placement, healthcare, mental health care services, educational opportunities, and then infrastructure investments like affordable housing and transit. And our analysis looks just at police department budgets and incarceration because we felt it was the most straightforward way to compare and consistently look at spending across cities. But it's really important to note that this is actually a pretty conservative view of the money that cities spend to criminalize folks, because we don't even look at the district attorney or the courts or other various expenditures within the city and county budgets. The analysis looks at both total city spending and general fund spending. So what that means is we look at the total city budget, which includes city funds, but also the state and the federal funds that flow through the city budget. But we also look at the general fund because this is the most flexible and discretionary fund that council members have kind of the most direct influence to change from year to year. And so each profile, if you look through the report, we take 3 views of the budget. The first is we look at the total spending on police versus these safety resources that community members define. 2 is we look at for every dollar spent on policing, what is spent on these important community resources. And it's pretty staggering to find that for every dollar spent on police, community safety measures actually just get pennies to the dollar, sometimes just a fraction of a penny. In cities. And third, we look at the percent of the general fund, again, the most discretionary fund that cities spend on the police. And so I'll leave it there and pass it on to Tracy.
Yeah, so you'll hear a little bit about campaigns, but we wanted to give you some key findings throughout the report. So there's really a misalignment of the city budget priorities and what we see on the ground from communities. We've actually started calling it community-owned safety. So what do people who live in these neighborhoods actually see as something that keeps them safe as opposed to policing? And across the board, we saw mental health, youth programming and infrastructure, such as transit access and housing. So amongst the 12 cities and counties that we profiled, per capita, we saw that police spending was at the lowest, $381 per person, and at the highest, $772 per person. We talked a little bit about the general fund, and on average, about 30% of the general fund budget go to policing. We saw what I consider to be kind of a staggering hike in Oakland at about 41.2%. So 41.2% of the general fund budget is not going to housing, is not going to mental health services, is actually going to policing and surveilling neighborhoods. And then lastly, we often look at just the regional problem. So folks will say things like, oh, this is a problem in the South, or this is a problem in the Midwest. But we look at cities and counties across the country. So even in cities that are considered progressive, who have elected officials who call themselves, for example, leaders of a resistance, we are seeing that while they might stand up to a national agenda, they are not standing up to the agenda where they actually have the most control, which is the city budget. So we'll throw it over to the map for folks to see just a little bit of what we were talking about, the mapping across the criminalization. And you can go and download the report, and I'll pass it over to the next speaker.
All right, thank you so much, Tracy and Kate. So now, kind of shifting from the nuts and bolts of budgeting, we want to talk about community governance and community control and self-determination in budgeting. So to do that, let's have Rosanna from Participatory Budgeting Project to take us through that.
Sure, thank you. And so next slide, you can go to the next slide. I just want to talk about a little bit about this report is like monumental in showing the disparity between spending on policing and spending on community priorities. And so participatory budgeting is a democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend a part of the public budget. Next slide. And how that works is from beginning to end, people most affected by the spending priorities design the process. And it's a process where all sorts of stakeholders, community members, and community-based organizations are involved in that. Usually in municipalities where we've done this, people brainstorm ideas. Everybody has an idea on how to spend X amount of money. The same people develop the proposals, investigate how much it's going to spend, how much things are going to cost. And then all the proposals at the end go on a ballot for the community members themselves to vote on. Once the winners are chosen, the projects are funded. And that's typically how participatory budgeting cycle works. Next slide. And so where does PB happen in the world? It started actually in the global south in Brazil, and up to date, hundreds of municipalities across the world have adopted this practice as a tool to engage community members in spending priorities. And just most recently, the biggest processes in Paris where $100 million were put into this process, which equals 5% of the Paris city budget, where participatory budgeting was done in district processes and in schools. So people in those districts and in those schools decide how to spend it. Next slide. And in the US, also several cities have taken it on. So participatory budgeting happens in New York City, in Greensboro, North Carolina, and several wards in Chicago, most recently in Oakland with community development block grants. Next slide. And really the crux of it is that it's community control. So here we have in this Freedom to Thrive report, we have the numbers of how much people spend on policing in these cities. And if just 1% of that money, if we pushed police departments or cities to give community control to just 1% of that money, let's say through participatory budgeting, that would mean that, like in Atlanta, for example, 1% of the annual police department budget would be $2.1 million. Imagine how people would decide to spend those $2.1 million. In Baltimore, it would be $4.8 million. In Chicago, just 1% of the police budget would be $14.6 million. And these figures are from the report. And so participatory budgeting through police can be done with police departments funds, because it can be done with existing funds that are already there. Next slide. And it ties into the Invest, Divest campaign, because if we're divesting from police departments and we're investing into communities, community members should have a direct say in how those funds get invested. And so here on the screen, you have a sample ballot from District 3 in San Francisco. And you can see that these are the exact priorities, the categories for how people decide how to spend the funds, and the ideas that come out of participatory budgeting are the exact community priorities that people would prioritize over policing. And these are the exact things that aren't getting enough funding. And so we see when people have control over money, they spend it where it's most needed in education, housing, jobs programs, open spaces, and their streets. And so even here for public safety, here you see a public awareness campaign and traffic light synchronization. These are the kinds of things that community members are identifying that would make them safer, and these are the ways that they're choosing how to spend public funds when they're allotted to do that. And just like the Vision for Black Lives says, we want investment in Black communities determined by Black communities. And participatory budgeting is simply a tool and a way to do that. It's how people can determine for themselves. Next slide. To learn more, feel free to go to participatorybudgeting.org, sign up to our newsletter, and we also have free resources if you're thinking about doing participatory budgeting or pushing or organizing and pushing for participatory budgeting in some of the Invest Divest campaigns that are already happening. As we saw in the pictures there, that was in Durham. We did an action in Durham where we pushed, instead of building a brand new, I think $81 million police building, we pushed for community priorities for that money to happen through a BYP 100 action last year. So last slide. Yeah, please feel free to contact me. There's my contact information there if you want more information on what participatory budgeting is and how to push for it in the Invest Divest campaigns happening all across the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosanna. So now we want to get into some of the nitty gritty of what's going on the ground. So we're going to get into our panel to introduce the folks that we have, the dope lineup. We have Kennard from Missourians Organizing from Reform and Repowerment from St. Louis. Kennard is a St. Louis resident and organizer. We also have Lily from Critical Resistance Oakland. Lily is campaign director at Critical Resistance and is a member of the Stop Urban Shield Coalition, which demands Alameda County and participating cities to shift funding from militarized policing and SWAT trainings towards life-affirming programs. We have Dean from the SNAP Coalition. Dean from the Racial Justice Action Center. We have Jamel from the Urban Youth Collaborative in New York. Jamel's an organizer at Cypress Hills. And the Urban Youth Collaborative is a coalition of youth-led organizations in New York City that fights for education reform and social, economic, and racial justice in communities. And we also have Diane Jones from Orlando. She's an organizer with Organize Florida, who's leading the organization's work around marijuana decriminalization. So just to remind folks that we have a chat box that you are welcome to put in your questions to any specific panelists or for all panelists. And if we have time, we will definitely get to them at the end. So I want to start off with a question to pose to all of our panelists tonight. If you could just share some of the work that you've done to push local governments or school districts to divest from policing and incarceration and invest in communities. So talk a bit about what your budget priorities were that you identified. How did you identify those budget priorities that you need additional investments in? What were some of your challenges and successes? So can we hear from Kennard first about some of the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, so we did a bunch of town halls across the area to talk to people about re-envisioning what public safety would look like. And in that, we really asked people what they think that public safety should look like and what they think it looks like currently in the cities that they live in. And we really compared that to a lot of models with other cities. And in that, we asked people to kind of map out what they think the city's budget should be spent on. So we kind of did a participatory budgeting exercise in those. And across those, I've run our campaign here at Moore called Decarcerate St. Louis. Across those, we really took some of those, such as spending less money on police and incarceration and putting that into things like housing. We have a serious problem here in St. Louis with people who are currently experiencing homelessness, and it's been getting worse since one of our biggest homeless shelters in the city just closed. So the mechanisms that we've been using to kind of bring that to attention and put pressure are really bringing that to the mayor's office and centering it in our organizing table that we have with a bunch of organizations from across the city. And we really each organization anchors one of those commitments, and we really drive those home when dealing with the mayor and platforms that we address her with.
Word. What about in Oakland with critical resistance? What are some of the ways and some of the work that you've all done? Talking specifically to Lily.
Hi, sorry, I was trying to get off mute. Yeah, I'm Lily with Critical Resistance. Can you do the next slide? So I just wanted to start with, this is some historical image here. This is a postcard that we produced when we were with the Stop the Injunctions Coalition to stop gang injunctions in Oakland successfully. And the framing was always this investment divestment. So here we see a picture of a graphic that represents the police dollars while they're defunding the West Oakland Community Youth Center. I'm going to talk a little bit more about our recent work with the Stop Urban Shield Coalition. If you could go to the next slide. So Urban Shield is an annual program that takes place in Alameda County. It's a police militarization program that exists in this nexus to terrorism that's funded by the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security then gives that money for so-called emergency preparedness, but we see that it's for policing and SWAT raids that are impacting Black and Brown communities, in addition to Arab and Muslim communities, but Black and Latino and Indigenous folks as well. Next slide. So just a couple of the organizations. I just want to note that part of our strategy around Invest Divest is really bringing in a broad base of coalitions that can help to inform what we need to invest in. So these are just some of the organizations, and that helps us to develop our platform around investment. The next slide. And also one of the aspects that we focus on is really developing strong points of unity. So one of the things to note is that we develop a very specific and concrete strategy around investments. And so those are in particular investments in emergency services. And for instance, emergency services when there is a disaster, and pointing out what are the main disasters that we actually think that we face in communities, that may be fire or earthquake in the Bay Area. And then what are the ways that that disasters, man-made disasters, impact our communities, right, in a broader sense. So both the specific strategy of here is where you can put money to address this issue that you're trying to address around emergency preparedness, supposedly. And then what is the broader political framing that we want to talk about, that the real disasters that our communities face is the lack of housing, the lack of healthcare, the need for more comprehensive and quality education. So doing both of those at the same time. In terms of some of the, I think next slide, please. So this is just some images of urban shields attacking residents of Berkeley Black Lives Matter protests. The next slide. Also, Urban Shield trainees have been involved in fatal shootings in Oakland and Alameda County. Next slide. The funding is very obscured, so some of the research that we've had to do is, this gives you a sense of how the funding breaks down and actually comes to the Urban Shield competition. So it goes through multiple players and multiple levels of government. So that's some of the research that we've had to really dig into. This is from a report that you'll find on the coalition website, stopurbanshield.org. Next slide. And then we also dug into the research of, I'm sorry it's so small, but the research of what types of funding the UASI Urban Area Securities Initiative funding could go towards and what it does go towards. So if you see the little 0 there, that's emergency management. And then if you see the larger one, that's policing. And then just a last note, sorry, my timer was going off. So just a last note, some of the other challenges that we've had are in Public Records Act requests. We've had a lot of stonewalling from the cops, so they won't tell us who participates in Urban Shield. So that's something that we're still trying to work on. And then on the research as well, our organizing has really backed up the research. So we've been able to make demands through having a strong community presence, demands for information from City Council or other, or the Alameda County Board of Supervisors or other participants in Urban Shield. So just to note that this work can't happen just on a research level, but as we all know, we have to have a strong community presence and really speak truth to power in that way.
Yeah, those numbers are staggering. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you.
Dean, what's going on in ATL? What's some of the work that you all been doing on the ground around Invest, Divest? Oh, you're on mute, Dean.
All right, can folks hear me?
There you go.
All right. Hey, everyone. So I'm Dean. I was saying that today's a really exciting day because today was the opening of the pre-arrest diversion office here in Atlanta, the first pre-arrest diversion initiative in the South. This work started back in 2013, and it was actually in response to a banishment ordinance that was being put forth by our city council that would essentially ban sex workers from living within the city of Atlanta. This ordinance was heavily rooted in trans misogyny and directly targeting Black trans women. And so our organization, along with a lot of community members, hundreds of community members in the city, came forward to stop that ordinance from moving. And in addition to that, not only stop the ordinance from moving forward, but demanded that the city invest in creating real solutions to actually helping Black trans women who were engaging in survival sex work. That working group of Black trans women and allies ended up becoming the genesis for what was our pre-arrest diversion campaign, and trying to find a solution around how do we actually make sure that our people are getting the resources that they need, and what are the interventions into the system that we can make now. And so that led us to pre-arrest diversion, which was happening in Seattle and had been really successful in diverting people away, particularly people with who suffer with substance abuse, who need mental health treatment, housing, job training, and really getting them out of jail and making sure that they're actually getting those resources. And so that ended up being a 3-year campaign just to convince our city council people to push this forward, this idea that we actually need to take care of our people and actually give them resources and support, being very distant from how Atlanta has done things historically. Our city jail that we're currently building a campaign to close, it was created in 1996 solely for the purpose that the Olympics was coming into the city and they needed a way to clear out all of the homeless people, and it led to mass displacement. And so that's the history of policing and the jail in Atlanta, and so that's what we were coming up against. But it took 3 years of organizing to actually get the pre-arrest diversion, the city council to vote on that. The city then invested $75,000 into the initiative, and we were actually, as a community who led and fought for this for 3 years, we were actually able to be in charge of hiring, and so choosing the director for the pre-arrest diversion program. We actually had our members, we have a trans internship program, and we actually had some of the Black trans women in our internship program do the training with the APD officers who would be doing this program. And so we've been very hands-on. We have been hands-on in the process of making sure that there's trans folks being hired as peer specialists, as our folks are getting connected to these services through this program. And so it's been really great to vision something 3 years ago and to watch it manifest, and then today to actually have the opening of the office for the first time. And so we're really excited to see the way that this helps get our folks out of this jail and in our communities.
Yes, congratulations. Shout out to y'all for the opening today. That's super inspiring work, and self-determination and action. That's really dope. So to move on through the South, let's go to Florida and Orlando. Diane, can you share some of the local work y'all been doing to divest from policing and incarceration?
Yes.
Budget priorities?
Yeah, about 3 years ago, Miami-Dade started a program for decriminalization of marijuana, less than 20 grams. So here in Orlando, we did some research on it and found that just on the Black youth alone, the city of Orlando spends over $3 million to prosecute and to arrest just the Black youth. We'd like to see those $3 million that they spend on housing and processing our young Black youth for less than 20 grams of marijuana invested back into the community for expungement programs, educational programs, and Black youth programs. And that's about it. We've gathered petitions and we've petitioned, and we're now trying to move those same policies into the county of Orlando, which we have kind of a hard time with, because the city was very open and very progressive in adopting these policies, but our county is not. It's mostly conservative. So that's where we are now, and wish us some luck.
Definitely sending vibes over there to Orlando. I know that it's definitely different terrain organizing on the city and county levels. And I think you see some of that in the report, actually, because 10 of the locales we profiled are cities and 2 of them are counties. And I think that there are some differences in organizing in that terrain. So thank you for lifting that up as a challenge that you all are facing. So I want to get into some more specific questions to pose to the panelists. And I want to start with Jamel. Actually, no, wait. Jamel actually needs to go through their presentation first. Jamel, can you take us through your slides to talk about some of your work? I almost skipped right over you and got into the specific,
Sure.
but can you give us the general first before we get there?
Thank you. So peace and blessings. I'm Jamel from New York with the Urban Youth Collaborative. And UIC, we've been working with different organizations. We're a coalition made up of different organizations from across New York City, working to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, reform school policy and education reform. And one thing we specifically worked on recently has been this Invest, Divest report, looking at how much money is spent on the criminalization of Black and Latino students throughout New York City, how much money is spent on the cops, schools, metal detectors, the security cameras, the hearings, and so on. And comparing that to how much money is invested into the positive restorative programs, counselors in schools, and things that students really truly want. So how we started our Invest, Divest report was having focus groups with different young people from across the city, and asking them what it is that makes them safe, what's something that they would want to have in their school, what's a necessity to them. And we pulled together the data and the information that we collected from young people from across the city, looking at what it is, what were their demands that they wanted in their schools, how much, where would they like to see the money that's invested in New York City, the budget, how much of that money would they like to see going towards restorative practices, towards after school programs, positive curriculum that identifies with young people, and so on. And in all reality, police never came up. Young people, out of majority of our conversations, when we discuss safety, police never really came up in terms of what they wanted. But yeah, at the same time, we are aware that, some young people and also parents as well have been systemally set up to believe that having cops and metal detectors in the school defines safety. So we, that's something we clearly was able to take away from those conversations, bring it back to our space with our young people, and then going back to the drawing board to redefine what does safety mean for us? What does that mean for young people in New York City? Looking at how much money is spent on the school safety agents in schools, which is far over 300 million, versus how much money is spent on restorative practices, which is less than 10 million. We were able to come up with a clear statement that what we want in our schools is counselors, not cops. When students say they want the money spent on their safety and for bettering their education and their futures, they're not saying they want that money spent in cops and metal detectors and police, and they would love to see that money spent in counselors, in Metro cards, in jobs, and Metro, things that young people actually need daily, right? Again, so if you look at the slide now, you look at the ratio of how much guidance the guidance counselor to the school safety agent ratio, and that's not including the actual cops in schools, right? So we have the school safety agents here, which is a part of the NYPD, and then we also have the police in certain schools as well. So this over-policing mentality, specifically in Black and Brown and Latino schools, Latinx schools, has been brainwashing some families and young people to assuming that that's what they need. But in our reality, in our focus group, we have come to find that's the complete opposite, right? And I think one strong thing to speak to in our report is centering the young people's voice. So students who share their own personal stories about what their day-to-day looks like, going to schools in New York City, interacting with police daily before you even receive your education, right? What does that look like? Students have been policed not only in their communities, but then they're also policed in their schools, and what negative impact does that have on their futures, right? Looking at the arrest, how much money is spent on arrests, students going to hearings, missing school to go attend hearings, students are given tickets and summons for minor infractions and nonviolent crimes. So like trespassing on different floors, having minimal amounts of marijuana, and really just exploring how much money is spent to that. And another thing that came out of our report also was understanding how much money is spent that we don't know, like the unknown amount. So it's a lot more than what we expected, right? So the price of installing the metal detectors, and so on. There's so many expenses that we probably would never actually have the bands that we know of that what is spent on policing, which is far over $1 million here in New York. With this report, we truly wanted to go defining what does safety mean to them, and also what it is they want to see that money invested in their school community, in their schools and in their communities, centering the young people's voices.
All right, thank you, Jamal. So we have about 15 minutes left. So I want to take about 10 minutes of that time just to pose a few pointed questions. I want to start with you, Lily, if you don't mind. Could you talk to us a little bit about how this Invest Divest frame relates to abolition, and just kind of talk us through like what modern abolition means and how this frame is useful, and specifically how that relates to the work of critical resistance in Oakland and building like safe spaces for communities by communities.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Janae. So just to summarize the definition of abolition that we use here at CR, so abolition of the prison industrial complex, we talk about the whole prison industrial complex, not just policing or prisons or surveillance, but all of those inner working systems, because we see it shift and one replaces the other, right? And we don't want that either. So prison industrial complex abolition for us is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and the court system, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So meaning we can't invest in anything that extends the life and scope of the prison industrial complex. And so I really liked earlier someone said that they're talking about community-owned safety, and I like that because it gives us something, framing that's different from alternatives. But when we talk about alternatives, there's sort of three things that we talk about that really hit home around the Invest Divest frame, and I think that that's critical to the understanding of abolition, right? We can't tear something down without creating the world that we want to see. First of all, because there just won't be the world we want to see there, and secondly, because we're setting ourselves up for failure, right? So in those alternatives, we need one, a means to addressing harm. So holding people accountable and shifting that, and holding also institutions accountable for harm, and most notably the state accountable for state violence and disrupting state violence. So in terms of individual harm, this includes different transformative and restorative justice models. We need to do the long-term investments in community to decrease criminalization and crime. So those are like housing, education, healthcare. And I want to just note here in terms of the investments, a lot of times when there's campaigns around like stopping a prison or stopping a jail, we have to be really careful because the decision makers sometimes, it's easy for them to jump to, oh, well, it would be cheaper to do electronic monitoring than expand the jail. So isn't this a practical, cheaper solution? And that actually, when we talk about investments in our community, oftentimes it's not cheaper. Like if we want to see all of the things funded that we need in order to thrive in our communities, it might actually not be cheaper than the police and the jails and whatever else. And that's okay, right? We still have the grounds to stand on. And then lastly, that we build our own solutions and means for care. And so just one quick example, coming out of the Stop the Injunctions work, we seeded a health workers cohort called Oakland Power Projects. And these health workers came together to create a series of workshops around knowing your alternatives instead of calling the police. So what are your options, knowing your options. What are your options instead of calling 911 if there's a medical crisis or a trauma or a drug overdose or things of that nature, and really going out and disseminating that into community. And so how can we really uplift community-based solutions in that work as well?
Ashe. Yeah, so I want to go to the middle of the map and kick it back to Kennard. Earlier, you talked a bit about some of the participatory processes that you all engaged in. Could you talk a little more about the reimagining safety town halls and like what are some of the concrete demands or organizing / political victories that they made possible?
Yeah. Right now, Decarcerate St. Louis is working on trying to close a city-run jail here called the Workhouse. It's a medium security institution. It's like our version of Rikers. We've really been like taking a lot of those demands that people have called for less money being spent on police, less money being spent on prisons, and called for the end of, well, working on alternatives for cash bail and the end of it. And in that, we've been like looking for ways to like put this money into other things. And while, you know, people on the other side of the fence will always be reluctant to listening to that, we've gotten gains in the way that we've scored a new circuit attorney. We've influenced the circuit attorney race here. And we're currently working with her to kind of push the mayor's office into coming up with solutions to get more people out of jails that are in the city. As for other stuff that came out of the town halls, we're still pushing on the housing issue. We're getting a lot of pushback from the city on that. They're not really coming up with that many solutions. So that's ongoing work that needs to be done.
Well, yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done everywhere, but I think you all I've started a really great model for how to really engage an entire community in such a process. Dean, could you kind of talk us through how you see your work around prison closure and pre-diversion programs that you mentioned today, and the development of a community-based case management system and decriminalization as all related to like a holistic invest divest strategy?
Yes, so the closing of ACDC, the Atlanta City Detention Center, has always been a part of our vision. And so we see pre-arrest diversion as one way of reducing the number of people that are in that jail. And so we see pre-arrest diversion as a radical form that actually helps us in the dismantling of the jail. Because instead of having a lot of people going in for these broken window policing types of offenses, right? Now we are seeing less people go to jail because they're being diverted into services. In addition to that, we've also have been working on decriminalizing a number of ordinances from small possession of small amounts of marijuana, doing some work around decriminalizing sex work, and a lot of other ordinances in the city. And so we're also in City Hall going towards those ordinances in addition to this program. And so we are trying to fight the system at all levels with the vision of hopefully being able to close the city jail within 5 years.
Dope. So we are actually pretty good on time. We got a really good question from the audience that I'm going to post to you all, and anyone who feels compelled can take it. So what has and hasn't worked for you all in terms of local coalition building among community groups with different focuses? This person is looking for best practices for local coalition building.
I can go ahead. In St. Louis, I'd say that like what's worked best for us for groups that have different focuses but similar objectives is really trying to like work to get more political engagement and education with people. That seems to have been very successful when we've done that in the past. We have like gotten a bunch of coalitions, gotten a bunch of people together to do a mayoral debate, and we've done a circuit attorney debate. And in those, we tend to ask questions that are a bit less softball than what you would see as of something that's done by like a mainstream media station or something like that. And we've gotten, in turn from that, we've gotten a lot more people who are really paying more attention to what's going on and more willing to get involved.
Any other organizations on our panel have experience with coalition building with other groups, different focuses?
I could share just quickly with the Stop Urban Shield Coalition. One of the things, I mean, I noted our political principles, so we spent a good amount of time developing political principles that are strongly worded, and then I think in terms of the coalition building, we've set up sort of like multiple tiers. So there is a strategy team that we have established that are more politically aligned organizations that are coming together with a clear internationalist understanding of militarism and understanding of abolition. And that strategy team helps to think ahead for some of the ways that we can move the organizing. And then there is a larger coalition. And at first, I would say that larger coalition wasn't all on the same, sort of on the same track. And through having that strong strategy team develop the leadership, a lot of coalition members now, I think, are very politically aligned. And then we have another sort of base of allies outside of that with other organizations.
Awesome, awesome. So we have about 4 minutes left. Wow, I did not expect for this time to go so smoothly. Y'all are really awesome. So with the few minutes that we have left, I just want to, encourage you all to download this report in its entirety. We're actually going to send, everyone who's on the webinar right now will receive this report via email. So download it, share it on social media with your friends, all your networks, all that good stuff. We're also going to send, along with a copy of the report, we're going to send a Budgets 101 toolkit that Marbury mentioned earlier in the call. But budgets aren't really a sexy thing, right? They're not really the most exciting things to talk about. So we're going to make budgets way more accessible for you to share with your bases, young people if you work with them, and just folks that you organize via toolkit. This webinar is also being recorded, so this recording will go out afterwards. And just also, this is a 100-page report, I think is what the total page count is. And so I know everybody doesn't necessarily have the time to sit down and read that in one sitting. So be on the lookout for more digestible, like infographics and other, more, accessible materials that really gets the content of this report out in other ways, moving forward. So just keep your eyes peeled for all that is to come from the Freedom to Thrive report to reimagining safety and security in our communities. I actually just got one more question, and we have 2 minutes left, and I wonder if anybody can do this like in 60 seconds or less challenge. What are some suggestions for redirecting folks away from 911 or police in crisis situations? In NYC, they have 311, but even non-emergency calls end up getting sent to 911. This is a question this person gets a lot. Anybody have any insight on suggestions for redirecting folks away from 911? I think maybe Lily, you might want to take this one, given the Oakland Power projects. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Does anyone else want to jump in? Because I weighed in on the last one. Well, I can definitely follow up and point people to resources in terms of the Oakland Power projects and some of the trainings that we do. And this is not an alternative to emergency response, but rather it's the way to empower people with the knowledge and the resources and the skills that they might need in order to be able to avoid calling 911, because we don't have other viable alternatives, even though we know that getting the cops involved creates more dangerous situations. And then also to be able to help people to mitigate situations. So if you have to call 911, the cops are going to come. How can you be the best advocate for the community around you and around the situation, as well as the person who may be experiencing violence or harm or may need help or be in an overdose or whatever the situation may be?
Yeah, we still have a lot of work to do to build alternatives to 911. See what happened with Charlene Lyles and what happens every day. But that is all the time that we have for this webinar. So I want to thank all of our dope panelists. Thank you, Mara and Kate and Tracy from CBD and Law for Black Lives. And thank all the audience members who joined and took the time, took that hour to spend with us. Please be on the lookout in your emails for all the resources that I mentioned earlier. And have a good night. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.